€175 a year. It can only work if the government installs meters to measure water usage in homes from next year. In with me in studio now is Dr. Bill Tormey, but also Fianna Fáil Councillor Paul McAuliffe, who is opposed to this and says it won't work because it took 25 years in Britain to install these water meters for a whole bunch of other reasons. My first question to Bill is, Bill, how can you do this to Middle Ireland? Why don't you turn around to your friends in the local authority system and tell them to take pay cuts instead of hitting on taxpayers?
Two things. Firstly, the EU-IMF deal. I'm going to trot out the usual political nods in the right direction at the beginning. The IMF deal requires us to do this in the first place.
No, it doesn't.
It certainly does.
They would be quite happy if we cut pay and waste instead.
Hold on for a second. The IMF, it's written down in cold English on the page of the November agreement. That's number one. The second thing is there's nothing precluding the government from reforming local government and from what
So why don't you do that first before you hit the taxpayer?
Can I get
the savings in first? That's my question.
Yeah, the budget deficit is 18 billion. Both have to happen at the same time.
No, they don't. Get rid of the fat first, Bill.
They do. We
keep hitting the taxpayer again and again. 4 years down the road, we have no serious cut in waste. You keep saying this. We have to do the same thing at the time.
We're only in government for 80 days.
Every government does nothing about waste. You keep hitting the tax.
We're only in government for 80 days.
And you're already pursuing the policies of the last government, which is destroying jobs and domestic demand. You're hitting the taxpayer. You're doing absolutely nothing to confront the fact that we've 4 local authorities running our capital cities, the highest management salaries in local authorities in Europe, the highest proportion of managers. We have salaries of arts officers earning 70 to 80 grand, Bill. Will you smell the bacon, Bill?
I will smell the bacon, Mark, and I agree with what you're saying. This is a question of timing and getting things done. The first thing the government did when they came in was cut ministerial fat, ministerial pay.
But token.
Fantastic, but that's the token that they actually did. The next token that you want is public sector upper salaries cut, and that's actually going to happen.
Tell me why we need 129 local authorities for a country with 4.5 million people.
We don't.
Explain it to me.
We don't.
Why don't you? How do you know you need to hit the taxpayer? Maybe you can achieve all these savings by rationalising local government.
The amount of money that's needed, Mark, is so big, 18 billion, that you actually need to do more than that.
But it's immoral. It's immoral to tax people, to increase taxes while you are still wasting money. It's grossly immoral. You should be eliminating the waste first. That way, at least if you increase taxes, people will know their taxes are not going to fund waste. As it is, all these tax increases are funding waste and overpay. No, you won't. You'll hit the taxpayers because they're politically weak, and when you think nobody's looking, you'll let the social partners off the hook. You won't do anything to bring
God forbid I interrupt you. Interrupt you, giving Bill a hard time. But I think your analysis is incredibly simplistic. You're essentially saying that we can't raise funds in any way unless and there's nothing being done in terms of spending. But first of all, there
is nothing being done. Fianna Fáil for 15 years allowed the local authority system to remain totally unreformed.
I should have let him shout at you.
You're both as bad as each other. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. You're both the same.
If you allow anyone else to have a word,
only to answer the right question.
Yes.
Why did you do nothing in Fianna Fáil for 15 years? You clobbered the taxpayer. You did nothing to cut waste because the county councillors and the local authorities are your friends, they're your social partnership buddies, and you don't stand with the taxpayer. At the end of the day, you back your friends.
Let me tear your entire argument apart.
Try.
First of all, there is a local government spending review which was brought in by the last government, and I understand is going to be continued by the current government. The city manager gives us regular updates in regard to that, and the city budget has been cut significantly in that
27 billion.
Yeah, in the last 2 years. So
what are we doing with 4 local authorities for our capital city?
Mark, that's a separate thing.
No, it's crucial. That's 4 local authorities, duplication, massive waste. Why is that still going on?
I'll tell you the reason, because
why didn't Fianna Fáil reform it?
It's on the agenda from me. I've discussion within the last 3 days with the deputy city manager.
Why didn't Phil Hogan announce it's happening?
Hold on now, Mark. I'm answering your question.
Is it going to happen?
We have in the northwest area said that the boundaries and the configuration of local authorities in Dublin need to be drastically altered, and we've actually passed motions.
Is Phil Hogan going to do it, Bill? Yes or no?
I think he'd be forced to do it, whether he likes it.
Why didn't Fianna Fáil do it? Why did Fianna Fáil spend 15 years
obviously, Mark, you didn't read the Dublin Mayor Bill, which did contain significant reform.
In the final year of the government's tenure, you waited more than a decade.
Well, actually,
you did nothing to reform not only the number of local authorities, but a corrupt system of planning, an economically dysfunctional system of local authority financing, which made a huge contribution to the financial crisis.
Mark, your analysis
You've got no credibility.
The creation of the 4 councils was a reaction to the corruption which existed in Dublin County Council. It was divided. It decided to divide it in 4 because councillors in the very north were voting in favour of things on the very south.
Corruption has nothing to do with the number of local authorities. There are the Manchester County Council.
No, but no more, Mark. Let me make the point.
Manchester Greater City Council has a large local authority dealing with more than 2 million people. It is not corrupt. And corruption has got nothing to do with this.
Did you ever hear of T. Dan Smith? Did you, Mark?
I didn't.
He was a famous man in Northumberland who spent a long time in jail for corruption. Corruption in local authorities is ubiquitous. Those of you who read...
Like FIFA.
Yes, those of you who read Private Eye would know very well the continuous and continuing levels of corruption in local authorities around England. They call it a Yorkshire relish and YR sauce.
What I'm getting here, guys, is Paul and Bill, you're all the same. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael.
No, Mark, we're just not agreeing with your simplistic analysis. We're just not agreeing with your simplistic analysis.
It's not simplistic analysis. It's a very simple analysis. The taxpayers' funding waits
because
you won't take on your friends.
Hold on.
You won't take on your friends in the local authorities.
Who are they?
The local councillors, the nice little networks. You don't want to rock the social partnership boat.
Well, Mark, that's a bubble you're pretending is there. What friends? Well, Bill is a colleague of mine on the city council, right? We're in different parties. We represent the same area. We're friends, but we would quite easily reform.
Do you think it's right that an arts officer position was advertised in Dublin Corporation for 63 to 84,000 euros a year by an organisation that failed to provide Rachel Peavoy with heating in her apartment?
Hold on now, Mark.
Before you go into
you're deviating there.
Do you think it's right
that's what you've
local authority managers are paid 120, 130 grand?
I'm going to allow Bill in on that point. But the point about the arts officer, I didn't agree with the embargo being lifted for that one post. The embargo was in place. It was lifted at an exception for the arts officer.
Do you think salaries like that should be left untouched?
I think local authority workers have received reductions in pay, Mark.
Sorry, they're still the highest by far the highest in Europe. They're still way more than a private sector worker. You're telling me you think an arts officer should be paid between 63 and 84 grand a year. Do you agree with that salary level?
The arts officer shouldn't have been appointed while the embargo was there. We shouldn't have an arts officer when we can't have
level appropriate? That's my question. Is that salary level appropriate?
Well,
yes or no?
It depends who it is. It depends who it is and what they're doing.
Talent.
33 arts officers in 33 councils around the country between 63 and 84 grand. You don't think that's wrong?
Well, I think if the embargo...
Actually, I think arts is very important, and you've had Alan Stanford in here talking about the arts. And hold on, before you go any further, Mark, I think you better say something into the microphone, because what you said about Rachel Peavoy in Dublin City Council is actually libellous. I happen to know what you've just said is actually incorrect and libellous, so I think you better just say sorry, because you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Mark, you've just said that she died because Dublin Council turned off the...
I will clarify it. She and her family
No, she said nothing. She was found dead.
Okay,
that's
the
very important
family argue that she had no heating. And I refer to the letter that I read out last week,
fine,
where she said she had no heating in her house. So I will clarify that. I will say, Bill,
I'm just telling you what you said was libellous, so just be very careful.
I have no intention to libel anyone.
This studio had already had one problem with that, and I don't want it to happen on my watch.
I apologise for anyone who feels liable. I'm certainly not trying to do that.
No, I understand, but I happen to know a fair bit about that particular case. In other words,
you're suggesting that county councillors, because we're involved in what you believe to be a semi-corrupt organisation, that we're not willing to reform it. We're the very people who are trying to reform it. We're the very people who are saying that county managers have too much power, that councillors should be full-time, that there should be less councillors. All of those things I believe.
But you won't do it before hitting the taxpayer.
Well, Mark, how can we do it? We're not in the members of the Oireachtas.
You were in government for 14 years.
I have never been in government, Mark.
Nothing.
I have never been in government. fault. We're in government.
We're in government.
We did make changes to the local authority system to prevent corruption, and we are now looking to see is that the right way to have it? Is there for local authorities the right way to have it? Is 150 odd councillors the right way when Boston only has 16?
Okay, I don't believe you'll do anything to reform it. I have no confidence in it. Let me turn to the issue.
That doesn't mean. Hold on now. Mark, just because you say you've no confidence in me in something does not mean it won't happen. Okay, that's an absurd situation
to pursue. Let's turn to the issue of a flat rate. Whether you agree with a property tax or not, is it right to have a flat rate?
No, is the straight answer.
No, and I would say no as well, Mark.
No. Okay. There should be A, B, C, and you should be, at the beginning of this, there should be levels of value of sites, and it should be just big 1, 2, 3, lowest level, middle level, and upper level, and there should be a different charge.
I tell you, let me look at one area concern
before you actually do the thing in detail, Paul.
The flat rate is essentially a poll tax. It's a community charge. It's a household charge. It's not a tax on property. It's a tax on the household. So somebody on social welfare renting a property is liable for this tax, or it would appear to be liable for this tax as much as the person who owns the property with no mortgage on it. And that's the difficulty I have with it. And I'm sure there.
Well, I have a difficulty with flat taxes on anything, to be quite honest, because I don't think flat taxes are justified.
And they do nothing to fund the infrastructure problems we have with water either.
All right, okay. I'm going to read out some texts. Rory, Mark, what is it exactly that you want these guys to say? You're being deliberately provocative and shouting at the lads, even whilst in mid-answer. Have a calm, intelligent discussion, please, because this is pointless. Rory, I'm trying to get them to do the reforms first, before they hit the taxpayer. That's what I'm trying to do.
Well, you tell that to the IMF. That's the point.
As far as I'm concerned, the
IMF, tell it to the
IMF. That's an easy answer.
It's not an easy answer.
The IMF and the OECD are bureaucrats paid by governments. They say what governments want them to tell. That deal bill says that because that's what the social partners wanted it to be included in there.
Mark,
they put it in through the Department of Taoiseach.
Until such time as we close the fiscal deficit, the difference between what we're taxing and spending, we are not in any way an independent country economically.
David from Waterford says...
And you know that as well as I do.
David from Waterford says, you're beginning to sound like Vincent Brown, Mark. I take that as a compliment. We are supposed to hear all sides of the arguments, not just yours. But David, the problem is that we're getting the same defence of the local authorities from both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
No, that's not true.
In my view. Dave from Meath says, will the government collect my household utilities charge from the management company I already paid them to, or will they just get rid of the management company and get the council to maintain our estate? I'm not paying utilities for my utility fees for my house twice, says Dave in Meath. Bill?
That is a very good point, and nobody has discussed that in the media. There is areas I know of private estates and private apartment blocks where people pay for their water. There's one in Hampton Wood, for example, in Finglas, and I would just love to know how the government proposes to have a flat tax on all of those people.
But it's not a utility charge that's being proposed, Mark.
It's a household tax.
It's a household tax. It's a community charge.
It's a household tax.
What do we get for it?
It's quintessential tax.
It's called a household utility charge.
What do we actually get from local authorities anymore that the private sector can't
I can
provide?
tell you this. You found out last Christmas when the place was iced up and everybody down to the civil defence and every fire brigade person and every city councillor were nearly working 24 hours a day to keep the place moving during the ice.
No disrespect to the wonderful commitment of the people who did that work.
And the other thing is you found when we were just teetering on the brink with water because there was water rationing all over the place.
But Bill...
And people went for a week with no water, so it just goes to show you how teetering on the brink we are in terms of services.
Having lived in Germany, having lived in Holland, those freezing situations are dealt with far more efficiently than they were dealt with in Ireland. That's no disrespect to the staff who did great work, but one of the reasons it was so inefficient here was because we've too many local authorities, we've too much duplication, and the work wasn't done properly.
Well, it wasn't duplicated
and no disrespect to the great commitment of the workers on the ground who were doing a fantastic job.
Wasn't it the coldest winter in 40 to 50 years or 100 years in some months?
But we'd had it the year before. We
did. That's why we had a good show this year. I mean, I'm going to say to you, Mark, that the performance of the City Council in relation to the snow and ice this winter was quite good.
Can I come back to your question about what do local authorities do? Because this is real ivory tower stuff. You may have private gyms and a big pot of money to look after yourself in your old age. But what the City Council do is they provide, for example,
25,000 people are visited every day.
Fantastic leisure centres that are provided open to everybody at a very low cost.
The private sector can do that.
Fantastic.
Cheaper and more effectively.
Well, in some cases the private sector do, but it's governed by local authority and regulated.
We're back to John O'Donoghue building swimming pools in Kerry that nobody wants to use.
Providing old folks accommodation, which
important.
Which Bill would agree is like one of the best in Europe. But the standard of old folks accommodation, certainly in places like Merville Court and Finglas and so on, is absolutely spectacular. So
they also
you
like
might
the tens of thousands of management positions that are unneeded.
There's lots of people out there that do.
But we don't need tens of thousands of management positions in local authorities.
Absolutely, we agree with you.
So why don't you deal with that first?
Because we are trying to deal with it.
But you're not.
The government
you
is
increase
reviewing
the tax immediately.
The previous government started a review of the public sector. The current government is waiting for a complete public sector review, at which the determination of how much redundancy pay, etc., 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 will have to be worked out with the boys in Merrion Street when they arrive, and that